Good afternoon. My name is Dana Ospina, and today I will be presenting Beyond the New Normal, a speculative reconsideration of undergraduate publishing. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the unceded traditional homeland of the Tongva people, a land, importantly, that many continue to call home. The slide before you depicts a work by contemporary Tongva artist Mercedes Durami. This work was exhibited in the Hammer Museum's Made in LA exhibition of 2018, and I'll give you a moment to read the brief descriptive quote I've provided from the exhibition catalog. I've included in my slides links to the artist's website, as well as to information on the exhibit, should you wish to learn more about her work. I want to say at the outset that this is a rather unusual conference presentation for me for a number of reasons. It is far and away the most personal conference presentation I've ever prepared, and also perhaps the least practical. I offer neither of these statements as apologies, but rather as caveats. I won't be providing any program outcomes, explicit strategies, or useful case studies, a confession that gives me no shortage of anxiety, as I find it incredibly hard to release myself from these expectations. Rather, this presentation is a gesture towards making sense of my experience of the past 14 months and how it has transformed my thinking about undergraduate publishing. Specifically, I'll present a couple of the ideas I've considered and briefly discuss the works that have initiated and informed them. It is my hope that in articulating these thoughts, even as cursorily as I must in the context of this presentation, perhaps I will open the door to opportunities to discuss them with others, a more desirable outcome than continuing to consider them in isolation. For me, the world feels completely and irrevocably transformed by the events of last year, but work continues moving forward. It's not my intention to use this presentation to assign blame, but rather to offer the observation that there seems to be in higher education an acknowledgement of the horror of our collective experience, simultaneous with an implicit expectation, including, I'll admit, self-imposed, that we carry on, figure it out, persevere, do more with less, and simply recalibrate ourselves to the new normal. While I would never suggest that what I've experienced is universal, I do know from conversations with friends, family, and colleagues that I am not alone. I would imagine there are those who will encounter this presentation who similarly have been contemplating how to move forward and make their work more meaningful, not only within the sphere of higher education, a system predicated on such things as reputation, disciplinary norms, metrics and outcomes, and evaluation, but perhaps even in contradistinction to it. For while models like green open access may allow us to perceive ourselves briefly and only partially as troubling the capitalist enterprise of publishing, we cannot escape the fact that current scholarly production perpetuates and traffics in the currency of academia, a system that is often unattainable, exclusionary, and arbitrary. When I first started to think about undergraduate publishing 6 or so years ago, it was primarily within the framework of creating new scholars, bringing students into the fold, educating them on the expectations of scholarly communication, and supporting their production of academic work, specifically academic journals. And I continue to do this work, and these vehicles remain an important part of an undergraduate publishing program for many students who wish to attend graduate school and pursue academic careers. But as the years have gone by, I have observed that undergraduate scholarship is often exclusively and, in my estimation, unfairly evaluated using the standards and norms of professional scholarly production, engendering a sense of precarity and anxiety for these creators. I started to become disillusioned with my approach and considered how to move beyond simply introducing students to academic publishing to providing a level of criticality and, importantly, alternatives to the traditional models. The students that I've encountered and worked with over the years who are not interested in becoming academics, but who are certainly interested in publishing, have compelled me to expand my approach in order to speak to and support their needs. As is often the case, as I returned to my abstract to prepare this presentation, I found the focus of my presentation had changed. And so what I will share is less directly focused on speculation than the description suggests. But speculation got me here, allowed me to quote, unsettle the present, quoting Stephen Clark, as quoted by Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby in Speculative Everything, design, fiction, and social dreaming. Invoking it released me from expectations and normalized conventions. But in so doing, it also made me mindful of how easily I could slip into a form of abstract, utopic thinking in which my speculation goes uninterrogated. And so I'm speculating, but I'm doing so mindful of current socio-historical and socio-political contexts, particularly as they play out in the arena of publishing, fully aware that the positionality of those doing the speculating is significant. The speculative strategy instrumental to this presentation is the what if, a thought experiment framework discussed by Dunn and Raby. According to the authors, what ifs, and I quote, allow the author to strip narrative and plot right down to basics in order to explore an idea, end quote. While in Dunn and Raby's context, the scenarios introduced by what ifs are fictions intended to allow for a suspension of disbelief and to encourage imagination, I find that the what ifs I have considered and chosen to speak about today are not fictions, but rather paradigms external to this context, unexplored, in my experience, in traditional academic undergraduate publishing programs. I'm sure many of you, in the course of your experience in libraries, and particularly within the context of conceptualizing new programs and services, have been encouraged to dare to fail. But honestly, at least in my experience, I've never really witnessed anyone being supported to fail, let alone being explicitly encouraged to consider failure as a desirable outcome. But what if we consider failure, particularly some aspects of it theorized by Jack Halberstam in The Queer Art of Failure? Failure, according to Halberstam, and I quote, dismantles the logics of success and failure with which we currently live. Under certain circumstances, failing, losing, forgetting, unmaking, undoing, unbecoming, not knowing may offer more creative, more cooperative, more surprising ways of being in the world, end quote. While clearly cognizant of the difficulties incurred in moments of failure, Halberstam suggests failure runs counter to and offers a means of, among other things, disrupting toxic positivity and American exceptionalism, ideologies that, at least to my mind, are powerfully present in academia in the United States. What if one were to support a program in which the outcomes were not the expressed or often only goal? What if, when we say the experience or process is the most important part, we mean it, even if that means embracing when the process is altered or forgotten or abandoned? Might there be a way to make space in undergraduate publishing for, to quote Halberstam, more undisciplined knowledge, more questions and fewer answers, end quote. To set the stage for contemplating a radical appreciation of failure in the context of undergraduate publishing, I invite you to consider Halberstam's suggestion that we, and I quote, resist mastery, end quote, and instead approach undergraduate publishing by, quote, investing in counterintuitive modes of knowing, such as failure. We might read failure, for example, as a refusal of mastery, a critique of the intuitive connections within capitalism between success and profit, and as a counter-hegemonic discourse of losing, end quote. Failure, as Halberstam suggests, and I quote, perhaps prompts us to discover our inner dweeb, to be underachievers, to fall short, to get distracted, to take a detour, to find a limit, to lose our way, to forget, to avoid mastery, and, with Walter Benjamin, to recognize that, and this is a quote from Benjamin, empathy with the victor invariably benefits the ruler, end quote. Well, I've introduced a small aspect of Halberstam's work on failure, a much larger project that unfolds counter to and as explicit critique of the heteronormative obsession with success essential to capitalism. I'm sure you're all already one step ahead of me in imagining and extrapolating out to the many models and theories that destabilize and offer alternatives to the patriarchal whiteness that continues to inform the majority of publishing contexts. An embrace and elevation of failure is but one manner of calling out and moving beyond the belief that the work we do in service of students is always already and only ever part of a solution, a telos worth examining, perhaps. Perhaps no one's work has informed, influenced, and inspired my thinking around publishing more than Paul Soulelis, a graphic designer, educator, author, and experimental publisher. Soulelis's work has helped me to recognize and develop connections between my prior life as an art historian and my current position as a publishing librarian. Unfortunately, 15 minutes does not allow me to discuss Sue Ellis's work in depth, but I encourage you to seek it out. The aspect of Sue Ellis's work that informs this presentation is that of urgent craft, a set of principles and practices he devised for design students and educators for, and I quote, documenting, agitating, redistributing, and interfering with power, end quote. Urgent craft, and I quote, prioritizes communal care as an urgent, never-ending practice, end quote. Urgent artifacts, as he calls them, take many forms. He mentions, to name a few, survival guides, messages worn in public, flyers, performances, social media posts, and they partake of the same systems and tools as other publishing contexts. To quote Sue Ellis, to talk of the urgent artifacts is to talk about publishing, end quote. Far from existing suspended in the realm of the speculative, urgent artifacts are being produced in the here and now in many sites of resistance. Sue Ellis also has created Queer Archive Work, a physical space not affiliated with RISD, the institution at which she is a faculty member. Queer Archive Work is, and I quote, a nonprofit organization with a mission to support artists and writers through queer publishing. It's an anti-racist community reading room with a small library of experimental publishing. It's a publishing studio with a risograph machine and inks and papers and binding equipment. And it's a project space, end quote. That is, quote, operating outside of and counter to legacy institutions like commercial galleries, museums, and art and design schools, end quote. Queer archive work is not the only space of its kind. Sue Ellis links to a number of precursor spaces and influences. But the speculative lure of this project for me is considering its evolution in relation to the experimental publishing courses Sue Ellis has taught and, at least of this current semester, continues to teach at RISD, and what that relationship has to offer by way of alternative trajectories for undergraduate publishing at institutions like mine. What if we were to apply urgent craft to our missions in non-art and design related contexts? What would it look like if undergraduate publishing programs, projects, and initiatives were not only to adopt some of the practices and principles of urgent craft outlined by Sue Ellis in the link I've provided, but additionally to foster and support the development of similar spaces by our students, spaces that exist external to our academic institutions? And what if students could receive credit for this work occurring outside the academy, produced against and in conflict with narrow exclusionary and largely hegemonic value judgments and expectations scholarly communication continues to perpetuate? What if part of our conception of publishing post-2020 was to amplify the role and significance of collaborative, community-based practices that de-emphasize personal reward and contingent validation in favor of criticality, care, and collaboration? Many of us subsist, I would imagine, in conditions in which we are forever demonstrating and explaining the value of our programs, aligning them to university missions and desired outcomes. And so it is somewhat inconceivable, even in a state of speculation, to consider promoting a scenario in which our tether to the university is supplanted by publishing practices whose destinations are unpredictable and largely not driven by us. The subtext, as we consider this at present, is, of course, a risk of orchestrating our own redundancy. As promised, I have provided no solutions, recommendations, or ready models. Rather, to return to Halberstam, I offer more questions and fewer answers. In closing, I ask, what if programs were developed and missions derived from the desires and needs expressed by our students? What if library practitioners were to offer up the tools and guidance and then sit back and observe as our students draw upon and harness the power of alternative models, and in the process, dismantle our constructs, trouble our expectations, and demonstrate for us the horizons of the publishable? Thank you.